Hi everybody, we are back with Lassie Come Home. The chapters we are going to read today are starting with A Long Journey's Beginning. Here's Lassie. She has just escaped out the gate that Priscilla left open for her, if you recall, instead of closing it. All right, so A Long Journey's Beginning. It was growing dusk as Lassie came down the dusty road. Now she trotted more slowly, and there was indecision in her gait. She halted and then turned back toward the direction from which she had come. She lifted her head, for she was badly puzzled. Now the pull of the time sense was leaving her. A dog knows nothing of maps and of distances as a man does. By this time, Lassie should have met the boy, and they should now be on their way home again, home to eat. It was time to eat. The years of routine told Lassie that. Back in the kennels, there would be a platter of fine beef and meal set before her. But back in the kennel was also a chain that made a dog a prisoner. Lassie stood in indecision, and then another sense began to awaken. It was the homing sense, one of the strongest of all instincts in animals. And home was not the kennel she had left. Home was a cottage where she lay on the rug before the fire, where there was warmth and where voices and hands caressed her. Now that she was lost, that was where she would go. She lifted her head as the desire for her true home woke in her. She scented the breeze as if asking directions. Then, without hesitation, she struck down the road to the south. Do not ask any human being to explain how she should know this. Perhaps thousands upon thousands of years ago, before man educated his brain, he too had the same homing sense. But if he had it, it's gone now. Not with all his brain development can man tell how a bird or an animal can be crated, taken miles away in darkness, and when released, strike straight back toward its home. Man only knows that animals can do what he can neither do himself nor explain. And in Lassie there was no hesitation. Her senses were now aware of great satisfaction, for there was peace inside her being. She was going home. She was happy. There was no one to tell her, no way for her to learn that what she was attempting was almost in the realm of impossible, and that there were hundreds of miles to go over wild land, a journey that would baffle most men going afoot. A man could buy food on the way, but what coin has a dog to pay for food? No coin except the love of his master. A man can read signs on the road, but a dog must go blindly, on instinct. A man would know how to cross the great locks which stretch from east to west, almost across the entire country, barring the way of any animal going south. And how could a dog know that she was valuable, and that in villages and towns lived hundreds of men with a keen eye who would wish to capture her for that reason? There were so many things that a dog could not know, but by experience a dog might learn. Happily, Lassie set out. The journey had begun. In the last of the long northern twilight, two men sat outside their cottage. It was like the other cottages of the village which lined that old narrow street. The walls were thick with whitewash coating of years. The elder man, clad in rough homespun, lit his pipe carefully and lifted his head as it drew freely. He watched the puffs of smoke eddying away in the still evening air. Then he felt the sudden clasp of the younger man's hand on his arm. "Will you see yonder?" The older man looked where the other was pointing. He sat some time until his eyes saw more plainly in the evening. It was a dog coming toward them. The younger man, who wore leggings and a corduroy suit, stood up. "Looks like a good 'un, Willie," he said. "Aye, good oi, a fine collie." Their eyes followed as it trotted near. Then the younger man stirred. "Havers, Willie, that looks like a fine collie belonging to the laird. It is, I'll swear it. I saw it twa days back when I were chillin' while I were chinnin' to McQueen aboot some salmon season. It'll be escaped, no doubt. Och, then there'll be, a reward for the mon that finds. Lush, aye. The younger man flung its last cry over his shoulder, for he was dashing out into the street. He barred the dog's way. They figured out that the Duke would be giving a reward for this dog that had escaped. In case you couldn't understand my Scottish. "Here, lass," he called. "Here, lass." He patted his head on his knee in a gesture of friendliness. Lassie looked up at him. Her ear had caught the sound which was almost her name, Lass. Had the man walked toward her, she might have let him place his hand on her. But he moved too quickly. Suddenly, Lassie was reminded of Heinz. She veered slightly and, without altering her trot, ran past him. The man dove at her. Her muscles flexed, and like a football star, she put on a spurt that upset his timing. She loped a few steps and then went back to the purposeful trot, but the man raced after her down the village street. Lassie quickened her pace again and broke into a steady gallop. The more he chased her, the more firmly it was becoming fixed in her mind that she must not let any human being put his hands on her. To chase a dog is merely to teach it to run away. When the Scot saw that he had no chance of catching the dog by speed, he halted and picked up a loose flint. He thought he could hurl it ahead of Lassie so that the sound of the falling stone might head her off and turn her back toward him. So he drew back his arm and threw. But his aim was bad. The stone fell almost at Lassie's shoulder. Even as it was falling, she changed her gallop, as a well-trained polo pony does, leading with the other forefoot. She veered away into the ditch. Belly close, she went at an amazing speed. There was a gap in a hedge, and she faded through it and shot away from the road, up into the bleak back country. Once there, she turned south again and went back to the steady trot. But now Lassie had learned one thing. She must keep away from men. For some reason that she could not understand, their hands were against her. Their voices now were rough and angry, and they shouted and threw things. There was menace in men. Therefore, she must keep away from them. The thought stayed firmly with her. Lassie had learned her first lesson in the first day. That first night, Lassie traveled steadily. Never before in her 5 years of life had she been out alone at night. So there was no training to help her, only her instinct. But the instinct within her was keen and alert. Steadily she followed a path over the heather-clad land. The path filled her with a warm satisfaction, for it was going south. She trotted along it confidently and surely. At last she reached a rise, and then, in the hollow below, she saw the dim shapes of farm buildings. She halted abruptly, with her ears thrown forward and her nose trembling. Her magnificently acute senses read the story of the habitation below as clearly as a human being might read a book. She read of horses standing in the barns, of sheep, of another dog, of food, of humans. She started down the slope warily. The smell of food was pleasant, and she had gone a long time without eating. But she knew she must be cautious, for men were there too. And it was becoming fixed in her mind that she must keep away from them. She trotted down the path. So here's our picture of Lassie looking at the buildings. Then there came a sudden challenging bark of the other dog. She could hear him racing toward her. She stood, waiting. Perhaps he was friendly. But he was not. He came tearing up the path, his mane erect and his ears flat. Lassie crouched to meet him. As he sprang, she stepped aside. He turned, giving loud voice in hysterical rage. His tones were saying, "This is my home, and you are an intruder. It is my home, and I will defend it." Then, from the farm below, came the muffled voice of a man. "What is it, Tammy? Stick 'em up." At the sound of the human voice, Lassie wheeled. She trotted away. This was not her home. She was an outcast here. The rough-coated shepherd charged as she loped away, worrying at her flanks. She turned quickly, her lips curling. As if that menace were enough, the other dog drew back. Steadily, she trotted on. The farm was soon left behind. She went over the wild country, following the animal paths. Finally, in a depression, she scented water. She found the small, cool stream and lapped greedily. The sky was graying in the east, and she looked about her. By a rock, she scratched gently with her forepaw. She turned around 3 times and then curled herself up. Behind her was the protecting overhang of the rock. Her head faced outward. Now, even though she slept, her nose and ears would warn her of any approaching danger. She put her head on her paw and sighed loudly. Early the next morning, Lassie was on her way again. She went steadily at a swinging trot that drove at the miles. Her muscles paced with inexorable rhythm, uphill, downhill. She did not pause or hesitate. Whenever a path ran to the south, she followed it. If it veered away, she left it, keeping to animal paths through the denser heather and brush. When a path led toward a town or a farm, she shied away, circling the habitations to keep away from man. So at the places where men lived, she went rarely, instinctively keeping under cover, gliding like a ghost under the shadow of thicket and brush, taking advantage of any woodland. For the most part, her ground lay uphill, for ahead of her was a range of blue mountains. Unerringly, she headed for the lowest dip where there would be a pass. As the day wore on and she gained higher ground and higher, the sky became overcast. The clouds looked laden. Then suddenly there was a flash, and thunder pealed. Lassie hesitated and whined in a quick, querulous tone. She was frightened. It is little use to blame a dog for having fear. A dog has so many braveries that its few fears do not cancel them out. And truth to tell, there are few collies that can stand thunder and lightning. There are many dogs that do not mind such noise. There are breeds of hunting dogs that are never so happy as when a gun is sounded, but not a collie. It seems as if this breed, having worked so long as man's companion, has learned that such sharp, savage sounds may mean hurt, and the crack of a gun will send most collies running for cover. Other foes they will face, but not the unknown danger of noise. So Lassie hesitated. The rolling peals of thunder echoed through the mountains, and the torrents of rain slashed down in one of the wild storms of North Scotland. For a long time she fought her fear, but at last it was too much. She trotted to a place on the boulder-strewn pass where overhanging ledges made a dry cave. There she crouched, pressing herself back against the rock as the thunder drummed and echoed like a barrage of guns. But if she had halted her journey, it was not for long. As the storm went muttering away down the mountain range, she got to her feet. For a second she stood, head high, questing the breeze. Then again she started, going in that long, swinging trot. The rain and the splashed earth now made the beautiful expanse of her coat tarnished and spotted, but she kept on going steadily, going to the south. And we have one more chapter for today. This is called The Fight for Existence. For the first 4 days, Lassie traveled without pause, resting only briefly during nights. The urge to travel south burned in her like a fever, and nothing could replace it. On the 5th day, a new demand began to gnaw at her senses. It was the call of hunger. After 5 days. The command to travel had blotted it out at first, but now it was insistent. She had had no trouble in finding streams to quench her thirst, but the problem of getting food was one far removed from her protected life. From her first memory, food had never been her responsibility. At stated times, it was provided for her. Man put it down before her in a platter. She had been taught carefully that that was her portion, and she must never eat any food that lay elsewhere. Year after year, that lesson had been driven into her. Food was not her responsibility. Man provided it. But now, suddenly, the training and conditioning of a lifetime were useless. There was no man to put down a pan of food each afternoon. And yet, this aristocratic animal must learn to exist. Lassie found the way. She did not reason it out as a human being would. Human beings have imagination. They can picture events and circumstances before they meet them. Dogs cannot do this. They must wait blindly until the circumstances faces them, and then do their best to meet it. Yet how could Lassie meet this new problem? She had not the brain of a man to reason about it. She could not base her conduct on the past experience of others of her kind, which is another human method. A young child does not have to undergo many dangerous experiences in life to find out the result, for his parents and the other older persons can tell him from their acquired knowledge what will result in such a case. No animal can pass on its own acquired knowledge to its young. Every animal must meet each new experience as if it had never faced his kind before in the history of the world. How then should Lassie learn how to feed herself? She had that quality which is in animals that man perhaps once had but no longer has: instinct. With instinct and the lessons of their own past experiences, animals manage to arrive at conclusions which man reaches by his reasoning power. It was instinct that drove Lassie daily in one direction. It was past experience that taught her to be wary of human beings. It was instinct that told her how to keep out of their sight, to follow the low ground of ravines, and to glide belly low on the skylines. Instinct taught her to find food. On the 5th day, as she went along, traveling at her fast, swinging trot, her senses began to warn her. She halted in the half-beaten animal track through the wild heather, and with head forward stood transfixed, her eyes, her ears, her nose, reading signs that came so faintly that a human being would have been insensible to them. It was her sense of smell that deciphered the puzzle first. There was a warm, thick smell, the smell of food. The habit of a lifetime impelled Lassie to run toward it openly, but instinct overruled habit. She dropped to a crouch, and with body low began to creep upwind toward the smell. Silently she moved through the heather, edging nearer and nearer. And then, suddenly, on the path, she saw what her nose had warned her of. Coming down the path, his snake-like body undulating, was a weasel. His head was lifted high, and by his side he dragged the freshly killed body of a rabbit. His game was much bigger than himself, yet the powerfully built killer was dragging it along at a surprising speed. When his senses warned him too, and he whirled in defiance. Dropping his quarry, he turned to face the menace. His savage white teeth were bared, and he gave a shrill cry that sounded like one of defiant rage. Lassie, with head low, gazed at him. She had never seen such an animal before. Nor was there in her breeding the instinct of the terrier kind, which will dash more quickly than thought of man at any form of rodent life. She was a working breed, a dog of peace, and yet instinct drove her on. Slowly the ruff on her neck rose. The lips curled back from her teeth. Her ears lay flat against her head. She gathered her hindquarters under her. But at the second she sprang, as if knowing the precise moment when that would be, the screaming weasel flashed aside. With lightning rapidity, he wove his way through the tangled heather, going silently, swiftly, flowing like water. Let me see a picture of the weasel. There she is, looking at the weasel. Lassie whirled to look for him, but her senses were drawn to something else, the warm blood smell of the rabbit that lay on the path. For a long time she regarded it. She came nearer, bending her head warily as if ready to spring away. For, though the blood smell of the food was there, the scent of the weasel still lingered too. Carefully her nose came nearer and nearer until it touched the freshly killed quarry. She drew back and walked around it. Then she came nearer and bent her head and picked up the game. She lifted her head again and waited. It was as if, in the wild land, far from all human beings, she was expected the sudden call of the master. "No, Lassie, drop it, drop it!" But no sound came. She stood indecisively for almost half a minute, and then it was over. Carrying the rabbit, she trotted along. She quested to right and left as she went. Then she saw what she wanted, a thick tangle of gorse that made a sort of den. She walked to it, coiled herself so close that she was protected on 3 sides. She dropped to the ground, letting the rabbit fall before her. She smelled it again. It smelled good. It was food. After that she had a newly acquired sense. She had learned the smell of rabbit. Instinct told her the rest. As she traveled along, whenever her keen nose told her of the nearness of game, she became a hunter. She scouted and ran and caught it and ate it. It was the sensible law of nature. She did not kill wantonly as man often does. She killed to live, and no more. Such food was just sufficient to sustain life, but that was all. Now there were no keen eyes to watch Lassie, to note her weight, to look at the color of her gums, to eye the quality of her coat. There was no one to say, "She's off a couple of pounds. Give her a little more beef liver at her dinner. She doesn't seem quite up to snuff. Better start giving her a bowl of milk in the morning. You might just drop a raw egg in it if she'll take it. I don't quite like the color of her gums. I think she's better to have a spoonful of cod liver oil once a day. That'll bring her up to condition. Not now, all those cares of the royal dog that lies of nights in a dry kennel." Instead, it was a dog with pinched, lean flanks, with coat blotched and torn, with petticoats and tail matted with burrs. But it was still a dog that had lived a life under loving care, so that it had known no sickness, and those years of care were telling now, for the frame was rugged and the muscles were strong, and they drove along, mile after mile, each day, and the heart was gallant and the instinct was true. And so the dog went, day after day, steadily south in the highlands, over bracken and heather, through hillland and plain, through stream and woodland, ever going steadily, always south. Now, next time, we are going to read a few more chapters, but I hope you guys enjoyed that for tonight, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.